Caithness.
Jim Allister.
Thank you very much. I would urge the committee to oppose and reject these regulations. I take issue with what the Minister said, that this is an improvement. The original propositions of the protocol were never implemented. The grace periods retain the current position. The current position is there are no pet passports, there is no documentation, there is no requirement to be part of a pet scheme to bring your pet from GB to the other part of the United Kingdom. What these regulations do, they impose a pet passport scheme. You must belong to a pet scheme. You must submit your dog, your cat, your ferret to documentary and identity checks upon getting on the boat and on leaving the boat. And all that within the one country. And all that because for the first time since Brexit, the EU legislated for the United Kingdom. And I want that to sink in. What this regulation does is impose the EU regulation that is set forward as 2023-1231. Now let me read you the title of 2023-1231. A regulation of the European Parliament, not of this Parliament, a regulation of the European Parliament and of the Council on Pacific roads relating to the entry into Northern Ireland from other parts of the United Kingdom of certain consignments of retail goods, plants for planting, seed potatoes, machinery and certain vehicles operated for agriculture or forestry purposes, as well as non-commercial movements of certain pet animals into Northern Ireland. And what this regulation does is to impose that foreign-made regulation made not for the EU, not applicable to the EU, made for this United Kingdom. Now, how is it we've got to the point that this committee is expected to merely nod to legislation made not by this House for this United Kingdom? And it's not that it's imposing obligations unique to Northern Ireland, it's imposing obligations on GB citizens. GB citizens who want to bring their pet either to visit family, to visit the Giant's Causeway, or to visit many of the tourist attractions in Northern Ireland. Now, courtesy of the demands of this foreign EU legislation, must belong to a pet scheme, must apply for and obtain a pet passport, must subject their pet to documentary and identity checks, and then and only then can they bring their pet internally within the United Kingdom. That is an astounding situation, an astounding imposition on citizens of Great Britain. An astounding imposition that extends, as I read this regulation, to even guide dogs. Think of it, that someone who needs a guide dog coming from GB to visit a relative in my constituency or elsewhere, or to visit the Giant's Causeway, which is in my constituency, has to have a pet passport. Why? Because, not a regulation of this House, but because legislation passed by the EU says he or she must have. And in Northern Ireland, we have many guide dogs which are reared in Northern Ireland for GB use. They are trained in Northern Ireland, And every one of them will be subject to this unnecessary regulation. And we are told all of this is to protect the EU market. And yet the farce is this, members of the committee. We're told you cannot have an SPS border where it should be, where the actual border is. You must have it in the Irish Sea. But the farce of these regulations is that if you bring your dog from GB to Northern Ireland and want to visit Donegal or Dublin or cross the border, then you must subject yourself to full SPS border where we're told it cannot be, at the actual border. How farcical is that? And that is the farce of these regulations. That you can't have an SPS border where it should be. You must therefore impose these restrictions on animals coming from GB to Northern Ireland. But if you do take your dog onwards to the Republic, then yes, you're subject to full SPS checks. Where you're told you can't even have an SPS border. The other dimension of these regulations, and the subservience that you're invited to submit yourself to, is that if the EU is dissatisfied as to the United Kingdom's implementation of these, then under the EU regulation, they can suspend them, they can take whatever steps they wish. So what this Parliament has been asked to do is, on behalf of its citizens, primarily its GB citizens, is to put them at the mercy of the EU's regulations, not United Kingdom legislation, and to allow them to be at that mercy, whereby their animal could be put into quarantine. And indeed, under these regulations, if you fail the documentary check, if you fail the identity check, you have to go into SPS custody. That, I assume, means you go into quarantine in your own country. You know, little wonder that the other place, the House of Lords, debated these regulations. I have signed and initiated an EDM that this House might debate them. I suspect it won't, but it certainly should, because these are a fundamental assault upon basic freedoms. And the other point I want to stress to you, most other things governed by the Irish Sea border are governed under the pretext that they are commercial. This is the extension of the Irish Sea border to non-commercial, to the movement of non-commercial pets. Now, why should that be? And indeed, we're told it improves the present situation. I've already explained why it doesn't. The present situation is free movement. But presently, you don't need to have a cat microchipped or a ferret microchipped. Yes, you have your dog microchipped, but you don't have your cat or your ferret. Under these regulations, a cat, a ferret, along with a dog, must all be microchipped to move within this United Kingdom. Frankly, members, I think this is a step far too far, and that this committee should take a stand on these issues and say, we cannot, we will not put this upon our citizens. And why should we? If all they're doing is bringing their best friend, their dog, with them within the United Kingdom. And that is why I invite you not to approve. And I do raise considerable concern that there was no impact assessment in relation to this. It was on the fatuous grounds that were less severe than what they might have been. That's no comfort. There should have been an impact assessment. And on equally fatuous grounds that there's no impact on business. Of course there isn't. They're non-commercial movements. But all the worse that we've now got to the point where non-commercial movements are those which are being dictated to us under these regulations. And as the honourable member has said, there was no public consultation. Why was there not a public consultation? This affects every dog owner, every cat owner, every ferret owner in Great Britain. Shouldn't there have been a public consultation? Particularly as it affects every guide dog owner, which is really where it does cut to the quick in regard to this. So I say to this committee, the case is not made for these regulations, and they should be taken back, because to go down this road is to take a step far too far in terms of being the subservience of a foreign parliament telling us what people in this country can do with their dogs and their cats and their fur.